I'd like to introduce our speakers for the first session. Sherry Dixon, Mike Kitto, and Calvin Murphy. Sherry is a biostatistician with more than 20 years of experience with the analysis of housing, environmental, and health and biological research data. And Mike Kitto is recently retired after 31 years as a research scientist and New York State Health at the New York State Health Laboratories and assistant professor for the School of Public Health at Albany. And they'll be followed by Jane Malone, who is AARST National Policy Director. And they'll be presenting on the Earth study. So the results are in for the Earth study, evaluating and assisting radon testing in housing and multifamily financing. Earth is a study funded by HUD to develop an evidence-based, statistically sound protocol for measurement professionals to correctly characterize multifamily buildings' radon levels. Welcome, speakers. Mike, you're first. You've got 20 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. After 3 years of encouraging the radon professionals to submit data and to participate in this study, I'm proud to say that we have the results today of this Earth study, and this is again based on data that was submitted by several or many of you radon professionals. So the possibility of having elevator radon in a multifamily building is dependent on variables such as the source strength underneath the building, negative pressure differentials that draw radon into the units, thermal bypasses, and uncontrolled entries, and lastly, the air exchange rate. So these variables make each unit in a building somewhat unique, as you'll see in some of the data that we present.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Are you screen sharing slides? All we see is a Zoom placeholder.
Oh boy. Okay.
You are screen sharing. You just need to switch your tabs, possibly.
Okay. Yeah, I have the tab up, but it's not coming up. Let me try using the, I avoided the PowerPoint because I had an issue with it this morning, but you will see. Okay, is that one any better?
Nope, we might, nope.
Okay.
Still says Zoom.
Let me stop share and let me go
stop
back to
share and try and start over.
Okay. Okay, how's this one?
There you go. You got it. Perfect.
Okay. So anyways, let's go down to the next slide. This is going to be a PDF because obviously the PowerPoint isn't working quite right. So as I said, this is an example of some of the multifamily buildings that were in part of this study. Many of these, as I'll show you later, are usually 3 stories or less, the majority of them. We are today only presenting data regarding the what most people would call the ground floor unit, or we call ground contact unit. These are almost always on slabs, as you'll see in some of the data in a minute. So we're going to be strictly dealing with this lower first level here. Oh, it's not going to, okay, so I'll have to move it by hand. So this is, as they said, this is a 3-year HUD study funded to examine the multifamily testing standards and protocols. When this study began in 2007, we had Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which are federal mortgage loan associations. They were requiring, or I believe still are, 10% of their ground contact units to be tested in order to determine whether a building has radon or not. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, who funded this study, they were doing 25% of the ground contact units, again, to characterize whether a building needed mitigation. If you abide by the ANSI AARST multifamily buildings standard, of 2017, you had to do 100% of the ground contact units. And as I've written down here in the red, some of the NRPP certified measurers and some states do require 100% of ground contact units to be tested for radon. So let me just give you a quick example of how these numbers work. So if you have in column 1 the number of ground contact units, as you'll see, many of our ground contact or of our buildings had ground contact units of 12 or less. So the 1 to 10 category would encompass quite a few of our units in our buildings. And in those, if you did 10% sampling, you'd only have to sample 1 ground contact unit in order to characterize the building. And you can see the HUD study of the HUD of 25%. They would require up to 3 ground contact units to be tested out of those 10. And as you can see, as the numbers go larger and larger, the number that have to be sampled increase proportionally. I think most of us would agree that if you have between 21 and 30 ground contact units and you're sampling only 3, that's a very low number to characterize the building, and even up to 5 to 8 units, in my opinion, wouldn't characterize the building very well. So this tells you, again, that we need something higher than 25%. There have been past presentations on theoretical sampling by Dr. Tony Neary. Here he presented at our symposium, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. Again, this is, I would call, a theoretical sampling. And Dave Wilson has also provided a couple of documents in the Radon Biz Radon Reporter of his studies on multifamily buildings. He has done quite a bit, primarily, I'll say, in the 4 to 5 unit ground floor unit buildings, somewhat smaller than the larger buildings that we dealt with. Also, on the right-hand side, I do want to point out that the AARST consortium does have standards regarding mitigation and measurement of multifamily buildings. So there are standards out there to which to apply to these multifamily buildings. So here's the study data requirements. If you have been to our symposium in the last couple of years, you've heard this before, as we've been somewhat soliciting the members to participate and provide us results. So in order to participate, you had to be NRPP or NRSB accredited. We only wanted just ground contact units. And I've highlighted this in red for those who are taking the quiz. This will be a quiz question. We started out requiring 100% of buildings. We ended up, we found that for, again, 90% of buildings less than 10 is still 100%. But if you get up 20, 30, 40 ground floor units, periodically we wouldn't be able to get into one unit to get a result. And so we made an exception to allow that we would miss one out of those larger buildings. So there had to be 90% or more of the units completed in order for us to use that building and the data from that building. We primarily focused on buildings with 5 to 20 ground floor ground contact units. We do have some larger buildings that we included, but they weren't the focus of the study. Also, in order to participate, you had to provide results from your QCs, 5% minimum, 5% blanks, 10% duplicates, and that you were also doing annual calibrations of your detectors, as I suspect we all do. Here's a list of some of the data that was collected, and this is not all of it. This was collected from each building. So the results, the unit number, the test type. One thing I'm going to talk about in a couple minutes is whether it opens to the outside. There's other things in here about the devices used, et cetera. But this is some EPA zone. This is just some of the data that we collected, and we'll show you some of the results of this today. So the data set, in the end, we ended up with 152 properties. from 29 states. This involves 687 buildings on these properties and a total of almost 7,900 residential units. So this is, again, we've weeded out and gone through and made sure that this is a very robust data set. 43% of these were in what we call assisted living housing. And in order to be included in assisted living, as assisted living housing, they had to be able to control their own thermostat. That way, that some houses, some living would be cooler and some would be warmer. You'll see, I think, as I present more of the data, that around 86% of the measurements were done in what the participants classified as their living room. And I should point out, even though we do have a large number of states involved in here and different properties, it does not necessarily reflect or represent what's in the nation, in the US. Okay, so here's some of the data from, this is the number of units measured by each state. As I said, 29 states. You can see a vast majority of them are from, I'll say, regulated states, such as Ohio and Illinois. I do want to point out Florida here, because that's going to be in the next slide I'm going to show you here. You have Florida, Kentucky, Pennsylvania. They're not the largest number of units in the study, but they are substantial. And so you see here a little over 400 units in Florida. Now, if we look at the percent of these units that are greater than 4, Florida sticks out. 40% of the units we measured down there had greater than 4 picocuries per liter of radon. And if you again look at North Carolina, Kentucky, Pennsylvania that I showed you in the previous slide, they were, again, a substantial portion of those, 25 to 30% sometimes, were greater or equal to 4 picocuries per liter. One thing I do want to point out here is in the text up here is it does seem that the higher percentage of units with elevated radon are in the warmer climates. And I'll talk about more of that in a second. So if we look at building size, we did not do anything less than 5 ground contact units. That was our minimum. And one reason for that is typically one unit to 4 units is somewhat still classified as single family homes. And so we started with 5 and went up. So you can see here, this is the total number of units on the y-axis, is that we, again, for up to 12 or so ground contact units, that really encompass a majority of the buildings that we dealt with. And you can see they went up to, I think our largest one was around 77 ground contact units. And if you can imagine that most of this multifamily housing is in urban areas where real estate is expensive, that they would have a tendency to want to go up rather than, you don't find 50 ground floor units in cities because it would just be too expensive for the land involved. So many of the urban ones are I'll say, in less than 20 ground contact units. So here's some of the summaries of the data. We had 4 different measurement devices, data from 4 different measurement devices. A vast majority of them were activated charcoal detectors. The rest were alpha tracks, electrets, and liquid scintillation vials. The data was approximately equally measured across seasons. So we did not have a big winter bias or summer bias, et cetera. They were scattered throughout the 4 seasons. 93% of the buildings were 3 stories or fewer. So again, we're not talking about high rises here very often. For the approximately 7,900 units, the arithmetic mean was 2.36 picocuries per liter. I want to compare that to the 1986 National Residential Radon Survey, which I believe included all housing. Their average in that study was 1.25. That was 34 years ago. We found it substantially higher for our ground contact units, but I think this study included other buildings besides not, ground contacts. So I would expect them to be lower. We had 1,163 units out of these approximately 7,900 that had greater than 4 picocuries. That's about 15% of the total. And again, the 1986 study found that 6% of the units, or 6% of the housing was above 4 picocuries per liter. And 84% of the measurements were done on what was classified as above slab. Many of us would be called slab on grade in the radon terminology. So let's some of the radon levels in the buildings from 5 to 20 contact units. We found that if you had a building with no ground contact units with greater than 4 picocuries per liter of radon, that the mean was quite low, around 1 picocurie. But if you had ground contact units which had more than one unit in the building, which was a substantial number of those, 1,800 and so, the arithmetic mean was above 5. So it goes to show you, and I'll show you here in a couple of examples, that the numbers can go in any building can go from literally 1 to 20. And I'll show you some examples here. Okay, so this is an example of occurrence of a radon in a building at a 7-unit complex. So there's seven buildings in this one area, one complex. They had ranged from about 8 ground contact units to this one, which had looks like 6 ground contact units. Again, these are only residential units, so they're not always going to be the same because you have offices, laundry, things like this, which are excluded from this study. These are all residential. So what I want to show you here is, again, the indoor radon level can go from literally almost 0 to over here on this one where it's above 45. So if we go back to the protocol, again, of measuring 10% of these units, you can see that would be 1 unit in each one of these buildings. It would be very easy to get most of these buildings, be able to hit that low one right there and these, and be able to say that these buildings don't have radon, when indeed they do if you did 100% testing. So let's go down to 25% testing. This is the same data. If you did 25% testing, that would require 2 units per building. And again, in these 5 different buildings, 5 out of 7, you could, again, theoretically or realistically, sample these 2 units out of each of these different buildings and classify these buildings as being low in radon at 25%. And again, I don't think that's acceptable to any of us seeing this kind of data. Okay, so when you look at these units, we wanted to look at the EPA zone and the number of units in here. And you can see for EPA zone 1 and 2 in the buildings, there was approximately equal number of buildings that had any unit above 4 picocuries per liter. And if you started looking at individual units, again, we have over 7,000 in zone 1 and 2, and they are relatively equivalent as the percent of radon greater than equal to or greater than 4 picocuries per liter. So that, again, zone 1 and zone 2 are somewhat indistinguishable as far as the radon is concerned in these units. And one of the questions we asked was the main entry to the unit opens to the outdoors. And if it opened to the outdoors, that would be yes. You can see that only 6% of the units had greater than 4 picocuries per liter, whereas if they did not have a main entry to the outdoors, there was approximately 3 times as many units with elevated radon. And you can draw your conclusions, but that may have something to do with the dilution factor from opening, closing that door to the outside. Here's another quiz question, a quiz slide, so pay attention for those taking the quiz. So this breaks down these units into climate zones and the percent of the units that are greater than 4 in these climate zones. And you can see that things which are classified as hot especially hot and humid, which would be Florida and southern parts of the US, there's a large proportion of these units that were greater than or equal to 4 picocuries per liter. This is somewhat surprising because most of us in our studies have thought of that stack effect is the primary driver for pulling the radon out of the ground, which would typically occur in a cooler environment. So you would expect these, something like this column down here, or this row, the cooler environments, that they would have a much larger percentage of the units greater than 4, and indeed we did not find that. We found that most of the high units are in the hot areas of the US. We also looked at the USDA plant hardiness zone. You've seen, if you plant gardens, you've seen these kind of numbers before. It tells you when you should be planting your garden or planting those seeds. And again, you can see over here in the right-hand column, percent of units greater than or equal to 4 picocuries per liter. Again, this has a tendency to be in the higher temperature ranges, and you don't see such a large percent in the colder regions, which kind of surprised me. When we looked at testing locations, again, this is from the, we didn't do this. This was provided to us by the measurer professionals. But again, most of these were what we consider above slab, a large majority of them, and or in the basement, and 16% of the units were greater than or equal to 4, which is surprisingly somewhat equivalent to what we would find for the units which were measured in the basement. And then we have the distribution of radon for those units that had more than 4 picocuries per liter. This is 4 to 6, 6 to 8, etc. And as you'd expect, as you get higher and higher amounts of radon, you'd have fewer and fewer of them. But again, we did have 59 units in this study which had more than 20 picocuries per liter. I would have certainly hated to miss those if I was measuring less than 100%. Because there's going to be health issues associated with those. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Dixon, who's going to talk about the statistical approach. So I'll stop share and let her go from there.
Morning. Can you see my slides here?
Yes.
We can. It looks great. Thank you.
All right, excellent. Move this aside. All right. So far, Mike has presented statistics about what we've seen in our data set, including some information about different sampling strategies. Now I'm going to shift to look at the details of sampling different percentages of units. And we're looking at 10, 25, 50, 75, or 90% of the unit sampling. There are 3 basic cases to consider when sampling less than 100% of the units. The first case is if the building has no units with radon above 4. In this case, sampling will always reach the right decision because no samples can contain a unit greater than or equal to exceeding 4. Second case is if all units in a building have radon exceeding 4. Again, sampling will always reach the right decision. Your samples always contain a unit exceeding 4. Third case is if some units in a building have radon exceeding 4. In this case, sampling may or may not reach the right decision because the sample may or may not contain a unit exceeding 4. Note that in the slides here, I present the percentage of our buildings that have these different situations. So we had 58% of our buildings had no radon exceeding 4. Only 3% of our buildings had all units exceeding 4. So this is pretty rare. The final case that some units of building have radon exceeding 4, 39%. Or 271 that fall into this group.
Hello, Sherry. Pardon
Yeah.
the interruption. Your
Mhm.
connection seems to be breaking up a little bit. I'm not sure if you can wiggle some wires around or something.
In the meantime, Dave asked a question through chat of whether there was done any work of season with radon levels. I have not done that, but that would be something that Dr. Dixon could do if we saw that it was of interest. Some of the stuff I presented today was just, some of it's not interesting. What I presented was a little more interesting. So there are some boring parts to this also, which don't show anything. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, we did bivariate statistics for radon levels by season. I don't think we observed a lot of differences, but I'll double check that after our presentation. I don't know, I jiggled the wires. I don't know if it's improved anything, but we'll see.
Keep on going. We'll find out. Thank you, Sherry.
Okay. Before we really dig into the errors, let's take a closer look at the rates, percentage of buildings with any units exceeding 4, and the percentage of units exceeding 4 by building size. So you notice in the third column, percentage of buildings with any unit exceeding 4, probabilities go up, but they jump around. I would have expected there to be a more stark trend upward here, but that's not what we found. And then in the last column, the percentage of units exceeding 4, these don't jump around a whole lot, but you see they are inconsistent. So this fact needs to be considered when you look at the error probability.
Hey, Sherry.
Like we will.
Sherry,
Yeah.
sorry to butt in, but maybe if you turn your video off, your audio will come through a little better. May help free up a little bit of
let me try
bandwidth.
that. Okay.
Should be down on the bottom left of your screen there.
No, your picture, Sherry, of you.
Yeah.
There it goes. Thank you. Let's try
All
that.
right.
If we didn't have some technical difficulties, it wouldn't be a virtual symposium, would it?
True. True. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. Now that we've had a look at the data, we're back to sampling. When we're looking at different sampling strategies, there are at least 2 types of errors that you want to consider. The first type of error is how likely is it that you miss positives when sampling in a building? This could also be expressed as what is the probability there are no units exceeding 4 in a sample among buildings with at least 1 unit exceeding 4. This is also known as the false negative probability. The second type of error is how likely is it that a building has any units exceeding 4 when the sample is all less than 4? These probabilities sound kind of similar, but they really aren't, largely because they have different requirements for inclusion. For the first probability, this only includes buildings with at least 1 unit exceeding 4. For the second error, this excludes buildings with a lot of units greater than or equal to 4, where the definition of a lot kind of varies as we look at the different sampling scenarios. But that's equivalent to the buildings have to have enough units less than 4 so that a sample could contain all values less than 4. Let's look at the first type of error that we saw in the last slide. That is the false negative error. So this is the probability that there are no units in the sample that exceed 4 among buildings with at least one unit exceeding 4. So trends going across, as you sample greater percentages of the population, the errors go down, of course, like you'd expect. Going down the table, so like within 10% sampling, going down that row, things jump around a bit. Well, this is largely because, as you saw in our data, things are jumping around a bit. The next slide presents the same information as the previous slide, except it's in a figure. So you can really see the effects of sampling higher percentages in terms of error probabilities, really declining up to 90% sampling. So if we move on to the second type of error, so this is the probability that at least one unit exceeds 4, given all are less than 4 in the sample. It's important to note that this, like I mentioned before, this only includes buildings with at least as many less than 4 as the number sampled. And generally, as you go across the screen, you see that the errors get lower when higher percentages are sampled, as we expect. Going down the table within a column, you see that probabilities jump around a bit, but they do tend to be higher with higher number of units in the building. One important note is what I had mentioned before, that these probabilities are dependent on the prevalence of the percentage of buildings greater than or equal to 4. So that cannot be forgotten either. There may be a quiz question concerning 50% radon sampling. So when we look at this center column, in general, when 50% are sampled and they're all negative, these probabilities generally, they jump around. It's kind of hard to spot a trend going on here. But what's important to note is that these probabilities do tend to stay below 50%, except for these last 2 cases. Our samples sizes aren't quite as big for those cases, particularly the last row. But it's still of interest. We considered whether we should cut off units that were larger, or cut off buildings that had more than 20 units, but we did leave them in most of our slides. Moving up, one more presentation before I discuss these a little bit. This next slide, it has some similarities to the previous slide, but this slide presents what happens when you test all units in a building and one test is invalid, or when you can't get into one unit in a building for testing. Is it good enough that all the units that you do have data for are negative? Well, if you look at the probabilities here, you see, well, what's happening with those probabilities? Generally, with higher number of units, there's higher percentages with errors, but this is a little bit deceiving because this is partially because buildings with higher number of units exceeding 4 are excluded by the requirements for the probabilities. Let's consider in buildings with 11 to 12 ground contact units. So 90% sampling means 10 out of 11 are sampled, or 11 out of 12 are sampled. So we have 102 buildings in this group. If we look at the number of units that exceed 4, 65% of the buildings have none exceeding 4. 12 have only 1 unit exceeding 4. 25 have more than 1 unit exceeding 4. And it's also important to note that 36% of the buildings have at least 1 unit greater that exceeds 4. So on slide 24 and 25, we found that the probability there are no units that exceed 4 in a sample of buildings with at least 1 unit that exceeds 4, or the false negative rate, is 2.8%. On slide 26,
Sherry,
Yeah.
sorry to butt in, but we've got 6 minutes left in this entire session, including Q&A and Jane.
okay, thanks.
Uh-huh.
I thought the 20 minutes was just Mike, not me. So, all right. So I'll speed up. So the important thing to notice is that both of these have restrictions on the number on buildings that are included. So which of these is correct? Well, neither one is perfect. Both should be considered, or maybe some overall probability of sampling reaching the right conclusion should be considered. For most of this presentation, we've been looking at analysis only based on whether radon exceeds 4 or doesn't. We've looked at other thresholds like 2.7, but we haven't presented them here. The exception is that Mike did present some arithmetic means and geometric means. There are some pros and cons of conducting analysis based on only looking at levels above or below a threshold. The pro is that we can look at probabilities like those above. It would be difficult to make assumptions about explicit radon levels in buildings, but it is manageable to estimate the number above or below a threshold like 4. The disadvantage is that there's no distinction between observing a radon level of, say, 41 picocuries per liter or 4.1 in a sample using a threshold of 4. We have this large, rich data set. Like Mike said, almost 8,000 units from 687 buildings. How can we use the actual radon levels? Well, we could look at questions like, what is the reliability in radon measurements among different units in a building? This is important when not sampling all units. We could also look at questions like, are buildings on the same property similar? In other words, does sampling one building on a property inform us about the other buildings on the property? This sort of analysis will be included in our article from this study. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Mike for the conclusions.
Just leave those up if you would.
Yep.
Okay, so anyways, here's the conclusions. This is a 3-year study that we found that the federal testing protocols that were used in 2017 were insufficient to effectively safeguard the study. As Dr. Dixon said, we had nearly 7,900 units. The main thing I wanted to show here was the third conclusion was that, well, it's the wrong conclusion. I changed my conclusion. Anyways, for all building sizes, 2 to 3% of the units with radon greater than 4 would still not be identified when we did 90% of the units. So we're still missing 2 to 3% of these units, even at 90% testing. So one of our conclusions is that a frequency, measurement frequency greater than 90% is needed. And we also found that these, as the bottom one said, these protocols, testing protocols from 2017 were inadequate to identify units containing greater than 4 picocuries per liter. And with that, I think we'll put it over to, oh, one more slide down, if you would, Sherry.
Did Mike freeze?
So this is a standard slide that needs to be in all presentations about the project, just reminding everyone the funding agreement under which the project was supported. The substantive findings of the work are dedicated to the public, and the author and publisher are solely responsible for accuracy, and interpretations do not necessarily reflect the views of the government. So it's just sort of a standard sign off. And with that, I'm going to, if it's okay, Mike, just start my slide. I think he's still frozen. So real quick.
I want to say that I
sorry.
did kind of misspeak when I said your part and Q&A. So if you want to continue into Q&A, since we don't have any Q&A right now, I think that makes sense.
Yes, and I actually have just a couple quick points. So in the meantime, if people are on, do think of some questions, feel free to put them in. If we don't answer them today, we'll get back to you. So thank you so much. And again, just a few quick slides here. What I wanted to talk about today was what's at stake and what's next. And again, this is a really important project. It's a very rich data set. There's a lot more to learn, but the essential finding, what's a safe protocol, is so important. Just to remind you all what's at stake from not testing 100% ground contact units. Obviously, and this is the main reason for this project, health risks of not testing thoroughly are clearly known. There's immediate risk to the occupant of the missed unit, and also risk to current future occupants if the building's not characterized properly. But in addition, loan programs, policies allowing less than 100% are nullifying state law, because we have in many state regulations a requirement that radon work be done under certain terms and conditions. And one of them is that 100% of the units need to be tested. Similarly, the loan programs, 10 to 25% policies conflict with private certification. All those who are here today, you know that if you're certified by NRPP, you must follow the standard, which includes testing 100%. Well, consultants who are taking these low bids in these states and anywhere in the country, any of this work, who are they using? Are they using certified persons, licensed persons? Who's doing that work? So at the end of the day, if 100% is not being implemented, then we have a question about whether they're complying with the part of the regulation or policy that says certified people must be used. And this is just a quick view of the states that have 100% testing policies or don't. So the left-hand column is all of our regulated states in the US, all 19 states. The middle column is who has to go with 100% because they must comply with AARST. And you'll see there are 2 states, Florida and New Jersey, where the rule change is under review to consider implementing the ANSI standards. And in the last column, you see the 6 states that are not ANSI. And by the way, Ohio does not actually have ANSI, but they have 100% requirements. So they're actually in the column of state, belong in the group of states that where basically these policies are nullifying state law. So what's the good news? Really, really good news. The HUD multifamily loan policy went under extensive review really over the past 7 or 8 years, but the 2020 brings a new set of revisions which have been published for comment twice. They haven't actually been implemented or put into effect, but the new HUD policy for HUD multifamily under the MAP guide, they're eliminating partial sampling. 100% of ground contact units must be tested. And I will say absolutely that preliminary findings from the Earth study really tipped the policymakers over the edge and convinced them that there's no way, it's just not safe to consider sampling under 100%. The elimination of the EPA Radon 3 zone exemption, that's another piece of the puzzle that is going away as of 2021 in the HUD MAP guide policy. Similarly, operation and maintenance plans must be attached to the loan documents and administered by the borrower. So important for the future of those structures and the health of the occupants. And you can see in the most recent issue of the Radon Reporter the full list of changes taking effect with the 2020 policy changes at HUD. Finally, what's next? The Federal Housing Finance Agency, that's the entity, the regulator overseeing Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. There's been continuous outreach and dialogue about testing policy. You can see some notes on the slide. CRCPD, the Conference of Radiation Program Director, Radiation Program Directors, has been very instrumental in sending their letter earlier in 2020 and having a meeting with FHFA. By the way, AARST also met directly with Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae last December. What's the ask? What all of us been asking? We want FHFA to advise or require Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae to just follow the HUD policy, which, as you know, is being updated to require 100%. And similarly, in terms of what's next, public housing, been a lot of talk about, what can happen in demonstration programs and future policy. AARST Government Affairs has been communicating with public housing, and remember that we've had two worlds at HUD, where the MAP guide governing the loan programs, where there's money on the table, those properties have been subject to a testing requirement. Public housing has not. So we're hoping that a big change is going to be happening in the coming months with public housing to bring it online and again, follow HUD, the HUD FHA policy. So last slide for this section, multifamily testing programs, 2020 and beyond. Just look at it. We've got Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And this is the same as the slide that Mike showed earlier. We're just adding what's going to be happening with the radon testing protocols in 2020 and beyond. It's a question mark whether we're going to see 100% with Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac separately with public housing, but we know we've got it with FHFA. And with that, I'm going to conclude our presentations. I'm going to go back and look at the screen to see if any questions were entered maybe in the meantime. No, there are no questions entered. Are we a wrap, Chad, or do we have more time?
We've got about 10 minutes left before questions, and we did have a couple of questions in the Zoom chat. Dawn had a question. Let me see what it says. She says, where was the testing done in Florida? Sherry and Mike, if you're still on, or Calvin, if you can answer that question, that'd be great.
Calvin.
I cannot off the top say where it was in Florida, but I could go back and look at the files and respond within a zip code. The actual location is confidential, with this information, but I can let you know within a zip code area as to where it was at. So I will go back and get that data.
Okay, thank you, Calvin.
Thank you.
Kevin Stewart says he has a question in the session Q&A box.
I have it. Want me to read it?
Okay, yeah, read it, please.
Given the counterintuitive result with hot, humid results higher than cooler areas, this makes me wonder about air change exchange rates for all of these units, which could help account for the trend you observed. What do you think? Mike, Sherry?
Mike has lost his Wi-Fi. So can Sherry or Calvin answer that question? I'm going to try calling him on my phone to see if I can get him this way.
And then there's another question. Did you see any seasonal variations in the hot and humid areas? And I can answer that one. We actually haven't done the seasonal review yet. That's still on the to-do list to look at the time of the year. And then here's another one for someone named Bill. Was ventilation and building pressure relative outdoors reviewed in this study? In other words, was there a chance that the hot, humid climate buildings were under negative pressure due to mechanical influence? Okay, let's see. I don't think that the team present can answer this question. I think this is a question left over from yesterday for Bill Broadhead. And then there's one more question from Dr. G. Have any or all lending agencies switched over to 100%? And yes, we've already answered that HUD FHA is in the middle of doing that. And he notes that in Ohio, that we're at 100% ground floor.
We have another question.
Questions sort of fallen out of order. I'm sorry, go ahead, Chad.
Oh, I was going to say there's another question in the Zoom chat. This may be more for the folks behind the scenes. Will the slides be available? And I believe the answer is yes, but please correct me if I'm wrong on that.
Yes, yes.
They are.
They will be. Okay, thank you.
It seems like we have no mic. So
Okay, should I keep going with the questions? A number have appeared. Would you like me to do that?
please.
Yes, please go. Keep going.
Okay, any theories? Oh, shoot, just hold it. I'm so sorry, my questions just fell out of order. There was the question about whether there were any theories. Well, let's move on here. Was there any consideration of radon source coming from concrete, especially in Florida? And the answer to that is no, that hasn't been. We did not look at alternative sources. We didn't record any theories about alternative sources. And then any theories as to why there's a higher radon entry into houses in humid climates? Perhaps others have answered that question on the chat, and I can't see that, the Q&A. but I don't think our panel has an answer on that one. Calvin, did you have anything on that? And here's a
Say-
comment. Go ahead.
Say again, ask the question again.
Any theories as to why there is a higher radon entry into houses in humid climates? Or chat,
No,
maybe.
I do not have, no.
Okay. Great study, Melinda Rockabee says, great study, where will you publish? And she would like to play with the stats. And Melinda, we'll talk offline with you. That's great. The publication has not been identified. That's a 2021 project to get the results published. Thanks. Which lending agency decided to increase ground testing to 100%? That is HUD FHA, the multifamily program at HUD. And then from Leo Mormon, question to Mike, very important study. Are you still adding buildings or units, or have you ended the study? The answer is we've closed the data set. Those are all the questions that I'm seeing. Do you see any other ones, Chad, anywhere else?
I'm not seeing any other questions. I believe there was one or two that we didn't have an answer to that we were going to look up. Has somebody made a note on those, Calvin, that you were going to answer one? You're going to look up some data?
Yes.
And I'm sure that there's somewhere that we can put that back in the Q&As later on once we get that answer, correct?
And if not, it'll be in the chat. I think the problem with this app is that the questions live according to a session. So unless you go back into that session to look at the questions, you might not spot that answer. We'll find a way to disseminate.
Okay, that sounds great. We've got about 5 minutes prior to the next session. Is there any more questions at all? If
Or
not,
Sherry, is there anything Sherry wanted to add that she cut out because she was speeding through her slides?
Not really. Just one note is that we asked about the heating system in units in the study, but we didn't gather any information like on air exchanges or anything like that.
okay. Thank you for that. That's typically not part of something that measurement professionals would do, but definitely something that all of us as mitigators are running through our minds. So